The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Millhaven, a small human settlement nestled between rolling green hills and ancient forests. 8-year-old Thomas McKinnon pressed his face against the cold glass of his bedroom window, watching the last of the merchant caravans disappear into the distance. They were fleeing, just like everyone else who could afford to leave. "Tommy, come away from there," his mother Sarah called from downstairs, her voice carrying the strain that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. "Help me pack the essentials." Thomas sighed and turned away from the window, but not before catching sight of the smoke rising from the distant mountains. The dragons had returned to the Shadow Peak Mountains after 3 centuries of absence, and with them came terror that gripped the hearts of every human settlement within 100 miles. Downstairs, his parents moved with urgent efficiency. His father David stuffed important papers into a leather satchel while his mother wrapped their few precious possessions in cloth bundles. The small cottage that had been Thomas's entire world felt different now, as if it were already becoming a memory. "Why can't we stay and fight?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. He had heard the stories whispered in the marketplace, seen the fear in grown men's eyes when they spoke of dragons. David looked up from his packing, his weathered face showing the kind of sadness that comes with difficult decisions. "Son, dragons aren't like the wolves or bears we sometimes see in the forest. They're ancient creatures with magic in their blood and fire in their breath. Humans don't fight dragons and live to tell about it." "But what about the heroes in the stories? Sir Galahad the Bold or Lady Meredith the Dragon Slayer?" Sarah paused in her wrapping, exchanging a glance with her husband. "Those are just stories, sweetheart. The real heroes are the ones who keep their families safe by making smart choices." Thomas wanted to argue, but something in his parents' expression stopped him. Instead, he went to his small bed and pulled out his most treasured possession, a worn wooden carving of a dragon his grandfather had made for him years ago. Unlike the fearsome beasts described in the stories, this dragon looked almost friendly, with curious eyes and an expression that seemed almost wise. "Grandpa used to say dragons weren't always evil," Thomas murmured, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "He said they were just misunderstood." "Your grandfather was a dreamer," David said, not unkindly. "And dreamers sometimes see the world as they wish it were, not as it truly is." The sound of hoofbeats on cobblestone made all 3 of them freeze. Through the window, they could see a rider in the blue and silver colors of the King's Guard approaching their door. David opened it before the man could knock. "Citizens of Millhaven," the guard announced without preamble. "By order of His Majesty King Aldrich, all remaining residents must evacuate immediately. Dragon activity has increased significantly, and we can no longer guarantee the safety of this settlement." "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "The last convoy leaves at sunset. Anyone remaining after that does so at their own risk." The guard's horse danced nervously beneath him, as if it too could sense the danger lurking in the distant mountains. "Pack only what you can carry." As the guard rode away to spread his message to other holdouts, Thomas felt something stir within his chest. It wasn't fear exactly, though he certainly felt that too. It was something else, something that pulled at him like an invisible thread leading toward the mountains where the dragons dwelt. "I'll be right back," he told his parents, slipping out the back door before they could stop him. Thomas ran through the nearly empty streets, past abandoned shops and houses where windows stared like hollow eyes. Most of the other families had already left, but he could see Mrs. Pendleton loading her cart with the last of her belongings, and old Henrik the blacksmith was boarding up his forge. He didn't stop running until he reached the hill at the edge of town, the one that offered the best view of the Shadow Peak Mountains. From here, he could see the source of everyone's terror more clearly. Smoke rose from multiple peaks, and occasionally he caught glimpses of massive shapes moving between the clouds. As Thomas stood there catching his breath, something extraordinary happened. One of those distant shapes separated itself from the mountain peaks and began flying toward him. At first, it was just a dark speck against the sky, but as it grew larger, he could make out the unmistakable silhouette of a dragon. Every instinct told him to run, to flee back to his parents and the safety of their cottage. But Thomas found himself rooted to the spot, not by fear, but by an inexplicable sense of wonder. The dragon was magnificent, with scales that seemed to shimmer between deep blue and silver as it moved through the air. The great creature circled overhead once, twice, then began to descend. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs, but still he didn't move. As the dragon landed perhaps 50 yards away from him, Thomas could see that it was even more beautiful up close than it had been in the distance. The dragon was enormous, easily the size of his family's cottage, but there was a grace to its movements that reminded Thomas of the cats that sometimes visited their garden. Its eyes, which Thomas had expected to be fierce and predatory, were instead a deep amber color that seemed almost curious. "You are not afraid," the dragon said, and Thomas nearly fell over in shock. The voice was like distant thunder, but there were musical undertones that made it oddly soothing. I should be," Thomas managed to say, surprised that his voice worked at all. The dragon tilted its massive head, studying him. "Yes, you should be. Your kind typically flees at the first sight of my people, yet you remain. Why?" Thomas thought about this question seriously. Why wasn't he running? Why wasn't he screaming for help? "My grandfather used to tell me stories about dragons," he said finally. "He said you weren't evil, just different, that humans and dragons used to be friends long ago." Something that might have been amusement flickered in the dragon's amber eyes. "Your grandfather was wise. There was indeed a time when our peoples knew peace with one another. I am Thessarian the Truth-Seeker, and I have been alive long enough to remember those days." "I'm Thomas," the boy said, feeling that introductions were important even in such an impossible situation. "Thomas McKinnon." "Thomas McKinnon," Thessarian repeated, as if testing the way the name sounded. "Tell me, young Thomas, what do you know of the current troubles between our peoples?" Thomas frowned, trying to organize his thoughts. "The adults say dragons have returned to cause destruction. They say you burn villages and steal treasure and eat people." Thessarian made a sound that took Thomas a moment to recognize as laughter. "Eat people? How wonderfully dramatic. No, young one, we do not eat people. Your kind is far too stringy and bitter for our tastes." Despite everything, Thomas found himself smiling. "Then why are you here? Why have the dragons returned?" The great dragon's expression grew serious. "That, Thomas McKinnon, is a question with a complex answer. Tell me, have you heard the name Malachar the Destroyer?" Thomas shook his head. "Malachar is one of my kind, but he has fallen to madness and rage. For 3 centuries, we have kept him imprisoned in the deep caves beneath Shadow Peak, but recently his power has grown beyond our ability to contain him. We returned to these mountains not to terrorize your people, but to prevent something far worse from escaping into your world." Thomas's eyes widened. "You mean you're here to protect us?" "In a manner of speaking, yes, but your people do not understand this. They see dragons and assume the worst. This misunderstanding makes our task more difficult, and time is running short." In the distance, Thomas could hear his mother calling his name. Soon, his parents would come looking for him, and when they found him talking to a dragon, he couldn't imagine how they would react. "I have to go," Thomas said reluctantly. "My family is leaving with the others." Thessarian nodded solemnly. "Perhaps that is for the best. The coming days will be dangerous, even for those of us working to prevent catastrophe." As Thomas turned to leave, the dragon called out to him. "Young Thomas, would you carry a message to your people for me?" "What message?" "Tell them that not all dragons are their enemies. Tell them that some of us fight to protect this world, not destroy it. Perhaps, if enough humans can remember the old friendship between our kinds, we might find another way forward." Thomas nodded earnestly. "I'll tell them, I promise." He ran back toward town, his mind reeling with everything he had seen and heard. As he approached his family's cottage, he could see his parents standing in the doorway, their faces etched with worry. "Tommy, where were you?" Sarah rushed to embrace him. "We were so worried." "I went to see the dragons," Thomas said simply. David's face went pale. "You what? Son, that was incredibly dangerous. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Thomas protested. "I met one of them and he told me they're not here to hurt us. They're trying to protect us from something worse." His parents exchanged the kind of look that adults share when they think a child is telling stories. Sarah knelt down to Thomas's eye level, her expression gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, I know you have a wonderful imagination, but dragons are dangerous creatures. They don't talk to little boys, and they certainly don't protect humans." "But it's true," Thomas insisted. "His name was Thessarian, and he told me about Malachar the Destroyer, and how the dragons are trying to keep him imprisoned and—" "Enough," David said, though not harshly. We need to finish packing and get to the convoy. The sun is already starting to set. As his family completed their hurried preparations, Thomas felt a growing sense of frustration. How could he make them understand? How could he convince anyone that what he had experienced was real? The convoy was a somber affair, consisting of perhaps 30 families with their belongings loaded onto carts and wagons. King's guards rode alongside them, their eyes constantly scanning the sky for signs of dragon activity. As they began their journey away from Millhaven, Thomas looked back at the only home he had ever known. The mountains seemed closer now, and he could see more dragons moving among the peaks. To everyone else in the convoy, they represented death and destruction. But Thomas knew better. Somewhere up there, Thessarian and his fellow dragons were fighting a battle to protect everyone, including the very humans who feared and hated them. As night began to fall and the convoy made camp several miles from town, Thomas lay in his bedroll staring up at the stars. His parents thought he had imagined his encounter with the dragon, but he knew the truth. The question was, what could one small boy do with such knowledge? The answer came to him as he drifted off to sleep, carried on the wind like a distant dragon's roar. He would find a way to help, no matter what anyone else believed. After all, if a dragon could trust a human child with the truth, perhaps there was hope for both their peoples yet. In the distance, barely visible against the night sky, a familiar silhouette circled the mountain peaks. Thessarian was watching over them, even now, protecting the very humans who would flee in terror if they knew how close he was. Thomas smiled and closed his eyes, already planning what he would do when morning came. The secret he now carried was too important to keep to himself, but sharing it would require more courage than an 8-year-old boy should need to possess. Still, as his grandfather had always said, the most important stories always began with someone brave enough to believe in the impossible. Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of horses neighing nervously and men shouting orders. He sat up in his bedroll, immediately alert despite the early hour. Around the camp, the king's guards were moving with urgent purpose, their armor clanking as they prepared weapons and mounted their steeds. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, pulling Thomas close as David emerged from their tent to speak with the guards. Captain Morrison, the leader of their escort, was a grizzled veteran with scars crossing his weathered face. He spoke in low, urgent tones with David and the other men, but Thomas could catch fragments of their conversation. "Spotted 3 of them heading this way, orders to evacuate immediately. No time for proper breakfast." David returned to his family with grim news. "The dragons are moving. The captain wants us packed and moving within the hour." As the convoy hastily prepared to depart, Thomas noticed something the adults had missed. The dragons weren't attacking randomly or pursuing them specifically. Their flight patterns had purpose, direction. They were heading away from the refugee convoy, deeper into the mountain ranges where few humans ever ventured. "They're not coming for us," Thomas said quietly, but his words were lost in the chaos of breaking camp. The next few days blurred together in a constant cycle of movement and fearful vigilance. The convoy traveled along ancient trade roads, moving steadily away from Shadow Peak and toward the larger city of Golden Haven, where refugees were being housed in temporary shelters. Each night, they could see the glow of fires in the mountains, and occasionally the silhouettes of dragons against the flames. It was on the 4th day that everything changed. Thomas had been walking alongside their cart, trying to ease the burden on their old horse, when a commotion erupted at the front of the convoy. Shouts of alarm rang out, and Captain Morrison galloped back along the line of refugees. "Dragon incoming," he bellowed. "Everyone take cover." Families scattered, diving beneath carts and behind supply wagons. Thomas found himself separated from his parents in the confusion, pressed against a large boulder alongside Mrs. Pendleton and her 3 young children. "Stay down, boy," the elderly woman whispered, her face pale with terror. "Don't make a sound." But Thomas couldn't help himself. He peered around the edge of the boulder and saw a magnificent sight that took his breath away. A dragon was indeed approaching, but this one was different from Thessarian. Its scales were a deep emerald green that seemed to shift and change in the afternoon sunlight, and it moved with obvious distress. The dragon landed heavily perhaps 100 yards from the convoy, and Thomas could see that it was injured. One of its wings hung at an odd angle, and there were what looked like burn marks along its flanks. Captain Morrison and his guards formed a defensive line, their crossbows trained on the wounded creature. "Stay back!" the captain shouted, though whether he was addressing the dragon or his own men was unclear. The dragon raised its head, and when it spoke, its voice carried pain and desperation. "Please, I mean no harm. I seek the human child who spoke with Thessarion the Truth-Seeker." Thomas's heart leaped. The dragon was looking for him. But before he could respond, Captain Morrison stepped forward, his crossbow steady. "Dragons don't negotiate," Morrison declared. "Whatever trick this is, we won't fall for it." "No trick, brave warrior," the dragon replied. "I am Verdania the healer, and I bring urgent word. The boy who met with Thessarion, is he among you?" Thomas started to rise, but Mrs. Pendleton grabbed his arm. "Don't be a fool, child. That monster will kill you." But Thomas gently pulled free. He had seen the kindness in Thessarion's amber eyes, and he recognized something similar in this injured dragon's gaze. Against all reason and the terrified protests of every adult around him, he stepped out from behind the boulder. "I'm here," he called out, his young voice surprisingly steady. "I'm Thomas." A collective gasp went up from the convoy. His parents appeared from wherever they had taken shelter, his mother crying out in horror as she saw her son standing in the open between armed guards and a dragon. "Tommy, get back here," David shouted, starting forward, but Captain Morrison held up a hand to stop him. Verdania focused her attention on Thomas, and despite her injuries, there was relief in her expression. "Thomas McKinnon, Thessarion told me of you. You must listen carefully, for I may not have long before the pain overwhelms me." "You're hurt," Thomas observed, concern overriding his fear. "What happened?" "Malachar's power grows stronger each day," Verdania explained, wincing as she shifted position. "The seals that have held him for 3 centuries are beginning to crack. Last night he managed to send forth a manifestation of his rage, a creature of pure destructive force. Several of my kin fell fighting it, and I barely escaped." Captain Morrison interrupted, his voice hard with suspicion. "This could be a trap. Dragons are known for their cunning." Verdania turned her attention to the guard captain, and there was ancient sadness in her voice when she spoke. "Captain, your sword bears the mark of the Brightblade Forge. That weapon was crafted by dwarven smiths using dragonfire to temper the steel. Your own ancestors worked alongside my people to create tools of protection, not weapons of war." Morrison looked down at his sword, clearly surprised that the dragon could identify its origin. "That was centuries ago. Things are different now." "They need not be," Verdania replied. "But there is no time for such discussions. Thomas, I need you to understand something crucial. Malachar feeds on fear and hatred. The more your people fear all dragons, the stronger he becomes. Every act of violence between our kinds weakens the seals that bind him." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You mean every time humans fight dragons, we're actually helping the bad one?" "Precisely. And worse, Malachar has found a way to influence the minds of some humans, turning them against all dragonkind without them even realizing it. There are forces working to ensure that peace remains impossible." Mrs. Pendleton had crept closer during this exchange, her expression changing from terror to fascination. "The child was telling the truth," she murmured. "Dragons truly do speak." "Some of us have always spoken to those willing to listen," Verdania confirmed. "But humans have forgotten the old languages, the old ways of communication. Thomas is unusual in that he remembers what his grandfather taught him, even if he doesn't realize it yet." Thomas thought about his grandfather's stories, the wooden dragon carving that still rested in his pack. Had there been more to those tales than simple fantasy? "What do you need me to do?" Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be dangerous. "There is a place in the deep caves of Shadow Peak where Malachar is imprisoned," Verdania explained. "The seals there are ancient, created by both dragon and human magic working together. To repair them, we need willing cooperation from both our peoples." Captain Morrison scoffed. "You expect us to believe that humans and dragons once worked magic together?" "Not belief, Captain, memory." Verdania fixed him with her gaze. "Your family name is Morrison. 700 years ago, a human mage named Aldwin Morrison stood beside the dragon lord Aurelius Goldwing to first create those seals. The magic flows in bloodlines, Captain. It flows in yours." Morrison's face went white. "That's impossible. My family has always been soldiers, not mages." "Magic takes many forms," Verdania said gently. Sometimes it manifests as extraordinary courage, unshakable loyalty, or the ability to inspire others to greatness. These too are forms of power. Thomas found himself thinking of his grandfather again, of the way the old man could calm frightened animals with just a touch, how plants seemed to grow better in his garden than anywhere else. Magic didn't have to be about shooting lightning or creating illusions. Maybe it could be about understanding, about building connections between different kinds of creatures. Verdania, Thomas said, the dragon's name feeling natural on his tongue. How much time do we have? 3 days, perhaps 4 at most. Malachar's influence grows stronger with each sunset. Already I can feel his whispers trying to reach the minds of your people. As if summoned by her words, Thomas heard angry murmuring from some of the refugees. A group of men had gathered near one of the supply wagons, and their voices carried clearly in the mountain air. "We're listening to a dragon now," one of them said loudly. "This is madness. Dragons are our enemies." "It's obviously a trick," another added. "They want us to lower our guard so they can slaughter us all." Thomas felt something cold and oily brush against his thoughts, like a whisper of hatred trying to take root in his mind. He shook his head vigorously, and the feeling passed, but he could see its effects on some of the other refugees. Fear was transforming into anger, suspicion into outright hostility. "He's already affecting them," Verdania observed with alarm. "The corruption spreads faster when people are afraid and displaced." Captain Morrison seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. His rational mind was telling him that trusting a dragon was foolishness, but something deeper, perhaps the bloodline magic Verdania had mentioned, was urging him to listen. "Assuming any of this is true," he said slowly, "what exactly are you proposing?" "I need Thomas to come with me to the sealing chamber," Verdania replied. "His grandfather's bloodline carries the old human magic, and more importantly, he is young enough to resist Malachar's influence. Adults who have experienced too much fear and prejudice cannot withstand the corrupting whispers." "Absolutely not," David said, stepping forward despite his obvious terror. "I won't let you take my son into danger." "Dad," Thomas said quietly, "what if she's telling the truth? What if this is the only way to stop something worse from happening?" Sarah joined her husband, reaching for Thomas. "Sweetheart, you're 8 years old. This isn't your responsibility." But Thomas stepped back, not away from his parents, but toward a middle ground between them and Verdania. "Maybe it is. Maybe that's why Thessarian found me instead of someone else. Maybe I'm supposed to help." The argument that followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever witnessed. Adults shouted at each other with increasing anger, their voices echoing off the mountain walls. Some demanded that the guards kill the dragon immediately, while others insisted on hearing more of what she had to say. Captain Morrison found himself trying to keep the peace while wrestling with his own doubts and the strange sense of recognition that Verdania's words had awakened in him. Through it all, Thomas could feel something pressing against his mind, trying to amplify his own doubts and fears. This had to be Malachar's influence, he realized. The evil dragon was somehow reaching across the miles to poison the thoughts of everyone present. "Stop," Thomas shouted, his young voice cutting through the chaos. "Can't you feel it? The more we argue, the stronger he gets. This is exactly what Malachar wants." The silence that followed was profound. Even Verdania looked surprised by the authority in the boy's voice. "Every minute we waste fighting among ourselves makes things worse," Thomas continued. "Verdania is hurt and needs help, and there's something terrible trying to break free that will hurt everyone if we don't work together." Mrs. Pendleton was the first to speak. "The boy is right. I can feel something wrong in my thoughts trying to make me hate and fear. I recognize it now that he's pointed it out." Captain Morrison slowly lowered his crossbow. "I feel it too, like oil on water trying to corrupt everything it touches." One by one, the other refugees began to nod in recognition. The insidious influence that had been growing stronger became easier to resist once they were aware of it. "Thomas," Verdania said, her voice growing weaker, "you have a choice to make. I cannot force you to come with me, nor would I want to. But know that if Malachar breaks free, no place in this world will be safe for human or dragon alike." Thomas looked at his parents, seeing fear and love and desperate hope warring in their expressions. He looked at Captain Morrison, at Mrs. Pendleton, at all the other refugees who had trusted him enough to listen. Finally, he looked at Verdania, wounded and far from home, fighting to protect everyone. "I'll come," he said simply. But I need Captain Morrison to come too, and anyone else whose bloodline carries the old magic. Morrison's hand went instinctively to his sword. How would we even identify such people? Thomas smiled, remembering his grandfather's words about magic taking many forms. We ask for volunteers. The magic will call to those who carry it, just like it called me to meet Thessarian. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the refugee camp, Thomas McKinnon prepared to undertake a quest that would determine the fate of two species. The secret he had learned from a dragon was about to become something much more, a bridge between worlds that had been separated by centuries of fear and misunderstanding. The journey to Shadow Peak took place under the cover of darkness, with Verdania's injured form gliding silently through the mountain passes, while Thomas and Captain Morrison rode on her back. 3 other refugees had volunteered to join them. Mrs. Pendleton, whose grandmother had been known as a woman who could speak with animals, Henrik the blacksmith, whose forged metals never seemed to break or rust, and young Alina Martinez, barely 16, whose touch could heal minor wounds and whose dreams often showed glimpses of future events. Flying on Dragonback was nothing like Thomas had imagined from the stories. Verdania moved with such grace that he felt as if he were floating rather than riding. The world spread out below them like a tapestry of silver moonlight and dark shadows, beautiful and alien from this perspective. "Are you afraid?" Captain Morrison asked, having to raise his voice over the wind. Thomas considered the question seriously. "Yes," he admitted, "but not of falling. I'm afraid we might be too late." As they approached the Shadow Peak Mountains, the reason for the captain's question became clear. The peaks themselves seemed to pulse with an ominous red light, and the air itself felt thick and oppressive. Thomas could hear something that wasn't quite sound but wasn't quite silence either, a thrumming that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "Malachar's heartbeat," Verdania explained, her voice strained with effort and pain. "The seals weaken with each pulse. We may have hours rather than days." They landed on a narrow ledge halfway up the largest peak, where an ancient cave entrance yawned like a hungry mouth. The opening was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when Thomas wasn't looking directly at them. "The entrance to the sealing chamber," Verdania announced. "Beyond this point, the corruption will be strongest. You must all be prepared to resist whispers of hatred, visions of despair, and promises of power." Mrs. Pendleton, despite her age, had made the journey without complaint. Now she studied the carved symbols with keen interest. "I've seen markings like these before in my grandmother's journals." She wrote about the old alliances between humans and dragons. Henrik nodded, running his calloused fingers over the stone. "The craftsmanship is incredible. Human and dragon techniques combined in ways I've never seen." Elena stood slightly apart from the group, her eyes closed and her face pale. "I can see flashes of what's coming," she whispered. "Pain, darkness, but also hope. The path forward is narrow, but it exists." As they entered the cave, Thomas immediately felt the oppressive weight of Malachar's presence. The evil dragon's influence was so strong here that it felt like walking through thick mud, each step requiring tremendous effort. The walls were lined with crystals that provided a dim, pulsing light, but their glow seemed sickly and wrong. "Stay close," Verdania warned. "The passages were designed to confuse intruders. Only those with pure intent can find the true path." They had walked for perhaps 10 minutes when the first attack came. It wasn't physical. Malachar remained bound in the deepest part of the cave system, but mental. Images of violence and betrayal flooded their minds, visions of dragons burning human settlements and humans slaughtering dragon young. "It's not real," Thomas gasped, pressing his hands to his head. "These are just lies meant to make us hate each other." But even knowing the source of the visions didn't make them easier to bear. Captain Morrison drew his sword instinctively, his face twisted with manufactured rage as he glared at Verdania. Mrs. Pendleton cowered against the cave wall, seeing phantom flames everywhere. Henrik's hands curled into fists, and Alina fell to her knees, overwhelmed by false prophecies of doom. "Fight it," Verdania urged, but Thomas could see that she too was struggling against the mental assault. "Remember why we're here." Thomas closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather, about the wooden dragon carving that represented friendship rather than fear. He thought about Thessarian's kindness, about Verdania's courage despite her injuries, about all the refugees who were counting on them to succeed. Slowly, the visions began to fade. One by one, the others also freed themselves from Malachar's influence, drawing strength from Thomas's example and their own memories of hope and kindness. "Well done," Verdania said, though her voice was growing weaker. "But that was merely the first defense. The corruption will grow stronger as we get closer to the source." They continued deeper into the mountain, navigating a maze of tunnels that seemed to defy logical architecture. Sometimes they walked on level ground, other times they descended steep slopes or climbed treacherous ledges. The air grew warmer as they went, and the pulsing red light grew brighter. "Tell me about the original ceiling," Thomas requested, partly out of curiosity and partly to keep everyone focused on their mission rather than their fears. "It was 700 years ago," Verdania began, her tale helping to distract them from the oppressive atmosphere. "Malachar had been one of the most powerful dragons of his generation, but power without wisdom led him down dark paths. He became convinced that dragons were the rightful rulers of all life on this world, and that humans were nothing more than clever animals to be dominated or destroyed." Captain Morrison frowned. "But dragons are more powerful than humans. Why didn't others of your kind agree with him?" "Power alone does not determine worth," Verdania replied. "Humans possess something that most dragons lack, the ability to grow and change rapidly, to innovate and adapt. We saw in humanity not subjects to be ruled, but partners in shaping the future of the world." Elena, who had been quiet since her earlier vision, suddenly spoke up. "Malachar couldn't understand that strength comes from cooperation, not domination." "Exactly. His hatred consumed him, literally transforming him into something monstrous. Eventually, he became a threat not just to humans, but to all life. The combined forces of dragons and humans were barely enough to stop him." They had reached a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. In the center of the space, an intricate pattern of symbols covered the floor, carved deep into the stone and filled with what looked like veins of silver and gold. At the heart of the pattern, a pillar of dark crystal rose from floor to ceiling, and within that crystal, something moved. "Malachar," Verdania whispered. Thomas approached the pillar cautiously, his heart racing. The thing inside the crystal was barely recognizable as a dragon. It was huge, easily 3 times the size of Thessarian or Verdania, but its form seemed to shift and writhe as if it were made of living shadow. Where its eyes should have been, twin points of red fire burned with eternal rage. "He's so angry," Thomas observed, feeling the waves of hatred radiating from the imprisoned creature. 7 centuries of imprisonment will do that," Captain Morrison noted grimly. "But look at the floor around the crystal." Thomas looked down and gasped. The intricate pattern of symbols was cracked in dozens of places, and in some spots the metallic veins had gone completely dark. Where the pattern was broken, small tendrils of shadow seemed to seep out, reaching toward their feet like grasping fingers. "The seals are failing faster than we thought," Verdania said with alarm. "We have minutes, not hours." Mrs. Pendleton knelt beside one of the larger cracks, studying the damaged symbols. "These markings represent the alliance between our peoples. As trust has broken down over the centuries, the seals have weakened." Henrik examined the dead metallic veins. The metal work was designed to channel magical energy, but it's been cut off from its power source. Without active cooperation between humans and dragons, there's no energy to maintain the binding. Elena closed her eyes, reaching out with her prophetic gift. "I can see the pattern as it should be, but repairing it will require perfect trust between all of us. Any doubt, any fear, any remaining prejudice will cause the magic to fail." Thomas looked around at his companions. An aging widow, a gruff blacksmith, a young woman with mysterious gifts, a career soldier, and a wounded dragon. A few days ago, most of them had never even seen a dragon, let alone trusted one. Now their success depended on absolute faith in each other. "What do we need to do?" Thomas asked. Verdania lowered herself to the ground, her injuries finally overcoming her strength. "Each of us must place our hands on one of the 5 primary nodes of the pattern. The magic will flow through us, connecting our life forces to power the seals. But the process is dangerous. Malachar will fight back, and his hatred will pour through the connection we create." "Could we die?" Elena asked quietly. "Yes," Verdania admitted. "Or worse, we could become corrupted ourselves, turned into instruments of his will." Thomas thought about this soberly, then looked up at his companions. "Do we have a choice?" Captain Morrison was the first to answer. Not really. If we fail here, Malachar breaks free and everything dies anyway. Mrs. Pendleton nodded. At least this way, we're doing something useful with our last moments. Henrik rolled up his sleeves. I've spent my whole life making things that protect people. This is just another forge with higher stakes. Elena opened her eyes, and they were bright with determination. I've seen glimpses of the world that comes after if we succeed. It's worth the risk. They took their positions around the pattern, each placing their hands on one of the 5 nodes that Verdania indicated. Thomas found himself directly opposite the crystal prison, close enough to see the hatred burning in Malachar's shadowy form. Remember, Verdania said as they prepared to begin, we are not just repairing the seals. We are renewing the ancient bond between our peoples. Let your thoughts focus on cooperation, understanding, and hope. Together, Thomas said, and they all pressed down on their nodes simultaneously. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged through the pattern, lighting up the silver and gold veins like liquid fire. But along with the raw magical energy came something else, Malachar's rage, pouring into their minds like molten metal. Thomas screamed as visions of destruction filled his consciousness. He saw cities burning, forests withered to ash, oceans boiled away to nothing. He felt the seductive whisper of power, the promise that he could rule over everything if he just let the hatred in. Around him, he could hear his companions crying out as they too experienced the full force of Malachar's corruption. But beneath the screams, he heard something else, their voices speaking words of encouragement to each other, reminders of why they were here and what they were fighting for. Think of your grandfather, Mrs. Pendleton shouted over the psychic storm. Remember the stories he told you. Thomas focused on those memories, on the wooden dragon carving, on the idea that different peoples could be friends. The visions of destruction began to fade, replaced by images of cooperation and mutual aid. I see the old alliances, Captain Morrison called out. Humans and dragons building cities together, sharing knowledge. The forges where we made tools of peace, not weapons of war, Henrik added. A future where our children grow up knowing friendship, not fear, Elena cried. Slowly, steadily, the pattern began to repair itself. Cracks sealed over, dark veins began to glow again with silver and gold light, and the tendrils of shadow retreated back toward the crystal prison. But Malachar had one more attack to make. Focusing all his remaining power, he sent a final surge of pure hatred directly at Thomas, recognizing the boy as the key to the whole effort. For a moment, Thomas felt himself wavering. The hatred was so strong, so seductive in its simplicity. How easy it would be to give in, to hate all dragons for the pain this one had caused, to let fear rule his choices. Then he thought about Thessarian's amber eyes, full of kindness and ancient wisdom. He thought about Verdania, wounded but still fighting to protect everyone. He thought about his grandfather, who had spent his whole life believing in the possibility of understanding between different kinds of people. I choose friendship, Thomas whispered, and his words somehow carried clearly through the chamber despite the magical chaos surrounding them. The ceiling pattern blazed with brilliant light, and Malachar's final attack shattered against the renewed bonds like waves against a cliff. The crystal prison solidified, its surface becoming mirror-bright and impenetrable. The evil dragon's roar of frustration echoed through the chamber, but it was already growing fainter as the magical bindings pulled him back into the deepest sleep. One by one, Thomas and his companions lifted their hands from the nodes, exhausted but victorious. The pattern continued to glow with steady light, no longer pulsing with Malachar's heartbeat, but radiating the warm, constant energy of cooperation and trust. It is done, Verdania said softly, her voice carrying wonder and relief in equal measure. The seals will hold now, perhaps for another 1,000 years. Thomas looked around at his companions, seeing the same exhausted joy in all their faces. They had done something impossible, something that would have seemed like fantasy just days before. What happens now? Elena asked. Verdania smiled, the first truly peaceful expression Thomas had seen on her face. Now we go home and we tell our peoples what we have accomplished together. The age of fear and misunderstanding is ending. A new chapter begins. As they made their way back through the cave system, Thomas realized that the oppressive atmosphere was completely gone. The air felt clean and fresh, and the crystal formations along the walls now glowed with warm, welcoming light. They had saved both their peoples, but more than that, they had proven that the ancient friendship between humans and dragons could be renewed. The secret Thomas had learned from Thessarian had become a bridge connecting two worlds that had been separated far too long. The real adventure, he realized, was just beginning. The return journey from Shadowpeak was vastly different from their desperate flight into the mountains. Verdania's wounds had begun healing during the sealing ritual, the positive energy of the renewed magical bonds somehow restoring her strength. She flew with renewed grace, carrying her human companions toward a world that neither species fully understood yet. Look, Elena pointed toward the horizon as they crested the final mountain pass. Smoke signals. Thomas squinted at the distant wisps of smoke rising from multiple points across the valley below. Is that good or bad? Captain Morrison studied the patterns with experienced eyes. Those are military signals. The king's forces are mobilizing for something big. Verdania's flight slowed as she noticed additional details that human eyes might miss. There are dragons responding to those signals as well. I can see at least 6 of my kin flying in formation with human forces. Together, Mrs. Pendleton asked in amazement. It appears so, Verdania confirmed. Perhaps our success in the sealing chamber has had effects beyond what we anticipated. As they descended toward the refugee camp where they had left Thomas's parents and the other displaced families, the scope of the changes became clear. The camp had grown enormously, but it wasn't just human refugees anymore. Dragons of various sizes and colors had landed nearby, and instead of the expected chaos and terror, Thomas could see people and dragons actually working together. They landed near the central command tent, where Captain Morrison's second-in-command, Lieutenant Barnes, was deep in discussion with a massive bronze dragon whose scales gleamed like polished metal. The dragon was gesturing with one claw toward a large map spread between them, apparently discussing strategy. Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Barnes called out, relief evident in his voice. Thank the gods you're alive, we have much to discuss. Before Morrison could respond, Thomas heard his name being called from across the camp. His parents came running toward him, their faces showing the complex mixture of joy, relief, and exasperation that comes with being reunited with a child who has just completed an impossible and dangerous quest. Thomas McKinnon, Sarah said, sweeping him into a fierce hug, you have a lot of explaining to do. Mom, Dad, Thomas began, but he was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure. Thessarian, the truth-seeker, approached their group, his amber eyes warm with approval. Young Thomas, the dragon said, inclining his great head respectfully. Verdania has told me of your success. You have done something remarkable. We all did, Thomas corrected. It couldn't have worked with just one person. David and Sarah stared in amazement at their son speaking casually with 2 dragons, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Around them, other families had gathered, their initial fear giving way to curiosity as they watched the peaceful interaction. How is this possible? David asked. Yesterday, everyone was fleeing in terror. Today, dragons and humans are working together. Thessarian answered thoughtfully. Malachar's influence had been poisoning the thoughts of both our peoples for centuries, even while he remained imprisoned. His whispers encouraged fear, hatred, and misunderstanding. With the seals renewed and his power contained, that corruption is lifting like a fog clearing from the mountains. Lieutenant Barnes stepped forward, his expression serious but hopeful. Captain, we've been receiving reports from across the kingdom. Dragon attacks have stopped completely, and several dragon representatives have approached human settlements under flags of truce. King Aldrich has sent word that he wants to establish formal diplomatic relations. The bronze dragon, who had been listening silently, spoke in a voice like distant thunder. I am Aurelius Goldwing, descendant of the dragon lord who helped create the original seals. For 7 centuries, my family has guarded the knowledge of the old alliances, waiting for the day when cooperation might be possible again. Thomas's eyes widened. You're related to the dragon who worked with Captain Morrison's ancestor. Indeed, and you, young one, have fulfilled a prophecy that has been passed down through our generations. It was foretold that a human child with the wisdom to see beyond fear would be the key to renewing the ancient bonds. Mrs. Pendleton, who had been unusually quiet since their return, suddenly spoke up. My grandmother's journals mentioned such prophecies. She wrote that the healing would begin with those too young to fully understand why they should hate. As word of their success spread through the camp, Thomas found himself at the center of an impromptu celebration. But it was unlike any celebration he had ever seen. Humans and dragons sat together around cooking fires, sharing stories and food. Children who had fled in terror just days before were now playing games with young dragons, their laughter echoing across the valley. Alina, who had been resting after the strain of the sealing ritual, approached Thomas with an excited expression. "I've been having new visions," she announced. "But these are different from the ones before. Instead of warnings about danger, I'm seeing possibilities, futures where our peoples work together to build amazing things." "What kind of things?" Thomas asked. "Cities that float in the air, held aloft by dragon magic and human engineering. Healers who can cure diseases by combining dragon wisdom with human innovation. Explorers who travel to distant lands together, mapping the far reaches of the world." Henrik nodded enthusiastically. "I've been speaking with some of the dragon smiths. Their understanding of metalwork goes far beyond anything we've achieved. They can shape metal with their breath, create alloys that are stronger than anything we've ever made. And they're eager to learn our techniques as well," added Aurelius Goldwing. "Human craftsmanship has a precision and delicacy that we admire. Together, we could create wonders." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the transformed camp, King Aldrich himself arrived with a full diplomatic escort. The king was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the scene of humans and dragons working together with expressions that ranged from amazement to cautious optimism. "Captain Morrison," the king called out as he dismounted from his horse, "your report spoke of unprecedented cooperation between our peoples. I had to see this for myself." Morrison stepped forward, snapping to attention. "Your Majesty, I present Thomas McKinnon, who has single-handedly changed the course of history." Thomas felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as the king turned his attention to him. "Your Majesty, I didn't do it alone. It was a team effort." King Aldrich smiled at the boy's modesty. "Even so, young man, your actions have opened possibilities that we thought were lost to legend. Tell me, what do you think should happen next?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think we need to start small, maybe with trade or shared projects that help both our peoples, and we need to make sure everyone understands that not all change has to be scary." "Wise words," the king agreed. He turned to address the gathered crowd. "I hereby establish the Alliance Council with equal representation from both human and dragon communities. Our first priority will be creating formal treaties that ensure lasting peace and cooperation." Thessarian stepped forward. "The dragon clans accept this proposal, Your Majesty. We have elected Aurelius Goldwing as our primary representative, given his family's historical connection to human-dragon cooperation." Over the following days, Thomas watched in amazement as the world transformed around him. Delegations from other kingdoms arrived to observe the unprecedented alliance. Dragon messengers carried diplomatic communications faster than any human courier could travel. Human engineers worked alongside dragon architects to design new settlements that could house both peoples. But perhaps the most significant change was in the children. Young humans and dragons, unburdened by centuries of fear and prejudice, formed friendships with an ease that amazed their elders. They created games that utilized both human ingenuity and dragon abilities, told stories that combined the mythologies of both cultures, and demonstrated daily that cooperation was not only possible but natural. "You know," Thomas said to his parents one evening as they sat around their campfire, "Grandfather would have loved to see this." David smiled, pulling out the wooden dragon carving that Thomas had carried throughout their adventure. "I think he knew this day would come. These stories he told you weren't just fantasy. They were memories, passed down through generations, waiting for the right time to become reality again." Sarah hugged her son close. "I'm proud of you, Tommy, but I'm also glad the dangerous part is over." "Is it though?" Thomas asked, not with worry but with excitement. "I mean, we've just started rebuilding the friendship between humans and dragons. There's so much work still to do." Alina, who had become a close friend during their shared adventure, joined their family circle. "I've had another vision," she announced with a smile. "I saw you, Thomas, years from now, leading the first joint exploration mission to the lands beyond the Western Sea." "Really?" Thomas's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really, and Mrs. Pendleton was there too, as the expedition's chief historian. and Henrik was the master craftsman, creating tools that combined the best of human and dragon techniques. Mrs. Pendleton, overhearing this prediction, chuckled. Well, I suppose I'd better start writing down everything that's been happening. Future generations will need to know how this all began. As Thomas settled down to sleep that night, surrounded by the sounds of a camp where two species were learning to live in harmony, he thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this point. It had started with a simple willingness to listen to a dragon's words, to look beyond fear and see the possibility of friendship. Now, as he watched human and dragon families sharing evening fires under the same stars, Thomas realized that the greatest adventures weren't always about fighting monsters or conquering enemies. Sometimes, the greatest adventure was simply learning to understand someone different from yourself. The secret he had learned from Thessarian had grown into something far larger than he could have imagined. It had become a bridge between worlds, a foundation for a future that neither humans nor dragons could have built alone. And this, Thomas thought as he drifted off to sleep, was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that cooperation was stronger than conflict, that friendship was more powerful than fear. In the distance, dragon song harmonized with human lullabies, creating a melody that had not been heard in the world for 700 years. It was the sound of hope returning, of ancient promises being renewed, of two peoples choosing to write a new chapter in their shared story. The age of fear was ending. The age of wonder was about to begin. 5 years had passed since the day Thomas McKinnon first spoke with a dragon, and the world had transformed beyond recognition. The refugee camp had grown into New Harmony, the first city in recorded history designed from the ground up to accommodate both humans and dragons. Soaring spires reached toward the clouds, connected by bridges that dragons could easily navigate, while underground chambers and surface buildings provided comfortable homes for human families. Thomas, now 13 and considerably taller than the 8-year-old boy who had changed history, stood on one of the highest observation platforms, watching the morning activities of the city below. Dragons and humans moved together through the streets, no longer strangers but neighbors, colleagues, and friends. "Admiring your handiwork?" asked a familiar voice behind him. Thomas turned to see Thessarian approaching, his amber eyes still kind, but now holding deep satisfaction. The great dragon had become something like a mentor to Thomas over the years, teaching him the ancient languages that had once allowed the two species to communicate more freely. "Our handiwork," Thomas corrected with a smile. "I never could have imagined it would grow this big." Below them, the New Harmony Academy was beginning its daily classes. Human and dragon children learned together, studying mathematics and history, dragon flight theory and human engineering, the ancient magical arts and modern diplomatic protocols. The playground echoed with laughter in both human voices and the musical sounds that young dragons made when they were happy. "Thomas," Thessarian said, his tone growing more serious, "there is something we need to discuss. A new challenge has arisen." Thomas felt a familiar flutter of concern mixed with excitement. Over the past 5 years, there had been several crises that required the kind of cooperation he had helped establish. Pirates threatening coastal towns had been stopped by combined human naval forces and dragon air support. Natural disasters had been mitigated through dragon, weather magic, and human engineering. Each challenge had only strengthened the bond between the two peoples. "What kind of challenge?" Thomas asked. "Representatives from the Eastern Empire have arrived in the capital. They bring word of a different kind of dragon, one that even we find difficult to understand." Before Thomas could ask more questions, a familiar voice called up to them from the platform below. "Thomas, Thessarian, are you up there?" Elena Martinez, now 18 and serving as the official oracle of New Harmony, climbed the spiral staircase to join them. Her prophetic gifts had only grown stronger over the years, and she had become invaluable in helping both species navigate the complexities of their renewed alliance. "Elena," Thomas greeted her. "Perfect timing. Thessarian was just telling me about visitors from the Eastern Empire." Elena's expression grew troubled. "I've been having visions about them for weeks. There's something coming from across the sea, something that will test everything we've built here." "What do you see?" Thessarian asked. Elena closed her eyes, letting her gift guide her words. "A dragon unlike any we know, ancient beyond measure with scales like starlight and eyes like the void between worlds. She calls herself the Cosmic Wanderer, and she brings questions that have no easy answers. Questions about what? Thomas pressed. About whether the peace we've created here can survive when faced with perspectives that are truly alien to both our peoples. The three of them descended from the observation platform, making their way through the bustling streets of New Harmony toward the diplomatic quarter where foreign delegations were received. Along the way, Thomas marveled at how natural the cooperation had become. Henrik the blacksmith, now the master of the city's metalworking guild, worked alongside dragon artificers to create tools and art that combined the best techniques of both species. Mrs. Pendleton, who had become the official historian of the Alliance, taught classes on the old friendships to ensure that future generations would remember how peace had been achieved. Captain Morrison, now General Morrison and head of the combined human-dragon military forces, met them at the gates of the diplomatic quarter. His face showed the same mixture of concern and determination that Thomas remembered from their journey to Shadow Peak. The Eastern Empire's delegation arrived this morning, Morrison reported. But they're not what we expected. Their leader claims to speak for dragons that exist beyond our world entirely. Beyond our world? Thomas asked. Dragons of the cosmos, beings that travel between stars. Apparently, word of our alliance has spread further than we realized. They entered the main reception hall, a magnificent chamber with a domed ceiling that opened to the sky, allowing dragons to enter and exit freely. At the center of the room, a delegation of humans from the Eastern Empire stood in formal diplomatic robes, but it was the figure beside them that captured everyone's attention. The dragon was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Where Thessarian and the other dragons he knew had scales in earthly colors, blues, greens, golds, and silvers, this creature's hide seemed to contain actual starlight. Her scales shifted and shimmered with colors that had no names, and her eyes held depths that suggested she had seen the birth and death of suns. I am Astrales the Cosmic Wanderer, the dragon announced, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Thomas's bones. I have traveled far to witness this unprecedented alliance between earthbound dragons and humanity. King Aldrich, now graying but still commanding, stepped forward to offer the traditional greeting. Welcome to New Harmony, Astrales. We are honored by your visit. The honor is mutual, King of Humans, but I have not come merely for ceremony. I bring news from the greater cosmos and a challenge that will determine whether your alliance is truly strong enough to endure. Thomas felt Alina tense beside him, her prophetic senses clearly picking up something significant about the dragon's words. What challenge? Thessarian asked, speaking for the earthbound dragons. Astrales turned her cosmic gaze toward the assembled crowd. There are others among the stars, civilizations that have watched your world with interest. Some view your recent alliance as a positive development, a sign that this world might be ready to join the greater community of intelligent species. Others see it as a threat, a dangerous precedent that could inspire cooperation among species they prefer to keep divided. You mean we're not alone? Thomas breathed, the implications staggering his young mind. Far from alone, young bridge builder. Your actions 5 years ago sent ripples through dimensions you cannot yet imagine. And now, those ripples have attracted attention. General Morrison stepped forward, his military instincts alert. What kind of attention? A test, Astrales replied. In 1 year's time, representatives from 12 different cosmic civilizations will arrive to evaluate whether humanity and dragonkind can truly be trusted with the knowledge and responsibilities that come with joining the galactic community. They will present challenges designed to stress test your alliance, to see if cooperation between your species is genuine or merely circumstantial. The hall erupted in concerned murmurs. This was beyond anything they had prepared for. The alliance between humans and dragons, remarkable as it was, had been focused on their own world. The idea of representing their planet to cosmic civilizations was overwhelming. What kind of tests? Alina asked quietly. Astrales fixed her starlight gaze on the young oracle. Tests of wisdom, courage, and unity. Each civilization will present a scenario requiring cooperation between your species to solve problems that neither could handle alone. Success will earn you a place among the stars. Failure, she paused meaningfully. Failure will result in your world being quarantined, cut off from cosmic civilization until you are deemed ready, if ever. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. He looked around at the assembled representatives of the alliance he had helped create. These people, human and dragon alike, had become family to him. The thought of their world being isolated because of decisions he had set in motion was almost unbearable. "How do we prepare for something like this?" King Aldrich asked. "By doing what you have always done," Astrales replied, and for the first time there was warmth in her cosmic voice. "By choosing cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, wisdom over pride. The foundation you have built here is stronger than you realize." Over the following months, New Harmony became the center of the most intensive preparation in human history. Representatives from every human kingdom and dragon clan gathered to coordinate their efforts. The old prejudices and fears were set aside in favor of a shared commitment to proving their worth to the cosmic community. Thomas found himself at the center of these preparations, not because he sought leadership, but because others naturally turned to him for guidance. His unique perspective as someone who had bridged the gap between species made him invaluable in planning their response to the cosmic tests. "The key," Thomas explained during one of the planning sessions, "is to remember that we're not trying to prove we're perfect. We're trying to prove we can grow, change, and work together to solve problems." Alina's visions became increasingly important as the year progressed. She could see glimpses of the coming tests, puzzles that would require dragon strength and human ingenuity, diplomatic challenges that would demand both species' wisdom, moral dilemmas that would test their commitment to justice and mercy. Henrik and the other craftsmen worked around the clock to create tools and devices that showcased the best of human-dragon cooperation. Thessarian and Aurelius Goldwing led educational programs to ensure that both species understood their shared history and values. Mrs. Pendleton compiled comprehensive records of their alliance, documenting every success and failure to show the cosmic representatives how they had grown. As the year drew to a close, Thomas stood once again on his favorite observation platform, looking out over the city that had grown from a refugee camp into a symbol of hope. Tomorrow, the cosmic representatives would arrive, and everything they had built would be tested. "Nervous?" Alina asked, joining him as she had so many times over the years. "Yes," Thomas admitted, "but also excited. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together." "The way we always have," Alina agreed. As the sun set over New Harmony, dragon families and human families gathered in their homes, united by bonds that had once seemed impossible. Children who had never known a world without dragon friends played games that incorporated both species' traditions. Adults who had once fled in terror from dragons now worked alongside them to solve problems that neither could handle alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect flying weather according to the dragons. Thomas dressed in the formal robes that marked him as an official representative of the Alliance, then made his way to the great assembly ground where the entire population of New Harmony had gathered. At precisely noon, the sky filled with ships unlike anything anyone had ever seen. They came in shapes and sizes that defied earthly logic, propelled by energies that made no sound and left no trails. One by one they landed, and from them emerged representatives of civilizations that spanned the cosmos. There were beings of pure energy that communicated through shifts in light and color, crystalline entities that sang their thoughts in harmonies beyond human hearing, mechanical intelligences whose bodies were works of art crafted from metals that did not exist on Earth, and others so alien that Thomas's mind struggled to process their forms. But as he watched the cosmic representatives emerge from their ships, Thomas realized something important. Each of these civilizations was different from the others, just as humans were different from dragons. The cosmos was not filled with uniform species, but with a vast diversity of life forms that had somehow learned to work together. Astrales stepped forward to address the assembly. "Beings of Earth and cosmos, the evaluation begins now. Over the next 7 days, you will face challenges designed to test the strength of your alliance and your readiness to join the galactic community. Remember that the measure of a civilization is not its power, but its wisdom." The first test came within hours. A massive asteroid was approaching Earth, too large to deflect and too dangerous to ignore. But it wasn't a real threat. It was a simulation, a puzzle that required both human mathematical precision and dragon magical manipulation to solve. Working together, teams of humans calculated trajectories, while dragons used their ancient magic to create forces that would gradually alter the asteroid's path. The second test was diplomatic. Two of the cosmic civilizations were presented as being in conflict, and humanity and dragonkind were asked to mediate. The challenge required understanding perspectives so alien that neither species could comprehend them alone, but together they could find common ground. Day after day, the tests continued, each one more complex than the last. But through it all, Thomas watched his friends and neighbors, human and dragon alike, face each challenge with the same spirit of cooperation that had brought them together in the first place. On the final day, as the cosmic representatives prepared to render their verdict, Thomas felt a deep sense of pride in what his world had accomplished. They had not been perfect in their responses to the tests, but they had been genuine, committed to their partnership and willing to learn from their mistakes. "People of Earth," announced the collective voice of the cosmic representatives, "you have demonstrated that your alliance is not merely convenience but conviction. You have shown that cooperation between different species can create solutions that neither could achieve alone. Welcome to the galactic community." The celebration that followed lasted for days, but Thomas found himself thinking not about the cosmic implications of their success, but about the small moments that had made it possible. A dragon helping a human child learn to fly. A human engineer working alongside a dragon to design a better water system. An elderly woman sharing stories that helped everyone remember their shared history. Years later, when historians would write about the day Earth joined the galactic community, they would focus on the dramatic tests and cosmic visitors. But Thomas McKinnon, the child who had shared a dragon's secret, knew the truth. The greatest achievements in history began with someone choosing to listen, to understand, and to believe that friendship was possible even across the greatest differences. As the stars filled the sky above New Harmony, carrying messages and visitors from civilizations beyond imagination, Thomas smiled at the thought of the adventures yet to come. The secret he had learned from Thessarian, that understanding was stronger than fear, had grown into something that would shape the future of multiple worlds. But at its heart, it would always be simple. Sometimes the greatest courage is not the strength to fight, but the wisdom to trust, the compassion to listen, and the hope to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. The cosmos awaited, full of wonders and challenges that humanity and dragonkind would face together, as they always had since the day a young boy chose to trust a dragon's words. The Age of Wonder had indeed begun, and its foundation was built on the strongest force in the universe, the friendship between different peoples who chose to see beyond their fears to the possibilities that cooperation could create. In the end, Thomas realized that was the greatest secret of all.